There's your cue, Justin. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. And I just want to give a thumbs up from Jim. Is the sound quality reasonably decent compared to where we were earlier? Not hearing anything from Jim, I'm going to take that as a yes. So, yeah, thanks for having me. And the reference to the App State Michigan connection, it's been many years now, right? But I was here when that happened, although I had nothing to do with the football team. But yeah, so this is a project that I'm working on. It will be a book one day. Hopefully Jim's not correct that it's the very distant future. Let's just say the near distant future. It's not going to be in the next year or two, but hopefully soon. And so today I just want to give you a taste of it, if you will. And what I'm really looking at is the long-term ramifications of battle on the men and their families and even their communities. And so we're going to use tonight as an opportunity to showcase some of that. So off we go with what I call reverberations of McPherson's Woods, which is where this battle took place, how an hour of fighting forever changed the men of the 24th Michigan and 26th North Carolina. So Private Peter C. Byrd of the 24th Michigan Infantry lay in the battle line that warm, muggy Wednesday afternoon of July 1st, 1863, near his younger brother, Robert. The Byrds hailed from Romulus, southwest of Detroit, and had joined the regiment at its inception in July 1862. To pass the time, Peter pulled out his pocket diary and briefly recapped the eventful morning for the 24th. His unit had already marched 6 miles and launched a successful attack before being ordered to take a defensive position on a thinly wooded slope known as McPherson's Ridge, just behind a stream called Willoughby's Run. As he wrote, he heard Colonel Henry C. Morrow encouraging the men to be prepared to hold their ground at all costs. Now, Byrd was unsure about Morrow. He felt the former Detroit judge was too lenient on some men who had committed serious infractions in the regiment. Less than 3 months earlier, Byrd had complained that Morrow had dramatically lessened the punishments for 2 deserters from the regiment, claiming, quote, he seems to feel more than the prisoners themselves and even cries while their sentences are being read. Byrd wondered if the soft-hearted leader of the Iron Brigade Regiment indeed had the necessary iron to hold the ground at all costs. Soon Byrd had much more to think about as he watched the long line of the 26th North Carolina Regiment rise from the ground, dress their lines, and step off into one of the most famous charges at the Battle of Gettysburg. When the North Carolinians launched their attack, Peter and Robert held their ground until the pressure became so great that Colonel Morrow ordered the unit to fall back. Robert fell back with the rest of his company D comrades without hindrance, but Peter lingered just a moment longer to fire a shot. As he turned to retreat, he was struck by a minie ball traveling at 950 feet per second, fired from 30 yards away from a 57 caliber Enfield rifle. The bullet gouged into his left leg about 6 inches below his hip and broke his femur in half, forcing the lower half of the bone to protrude through the skin and splintering the upper part at the same time. Byrd cried out and crumpled to the ground as the Confederates overtook his position, leaving him with the other human debris in their wake. As he lay bleeding and moaning and undoubtedly sweating, his leg grossly contorted, myriad thoughts raced through the 23-year-old's mind. Would his brother survive? Would he survive his own grim wound? And if he did, would his sweetheart back in Romulus still want him? But as the hours passed and he drifted in and out of consciousness, he must have wondered just when help would arrive, even if it was Confederate. Mercifully, Byrd knew neither how dreadfully long he would have to lay there untended, nor for how many years he would relive this afternoon's events. Earlier that morning, the men of the 24th Michigan had departed their campsite on the Emmitsburg Road, 6 miles south of Gettysburg, marching and joking with no idea of being on the verge of a battle, as Colonel Morrow recalled. Word soon arrived of serious fighting west of town, and they raced across the fields to take a position on McPherson's Ridge. They launched an attack that captured much of General James Archer's Tennessee Brigade. The Michiganders then took a defensive position in the woods on the western slope of McPherson's Ridge, where they waited several hours for the inevitable Confederate attack. That attack would be delivered primarily by the men of the 26th North Carolina Regiment of General J. Johnston Pettigrew's brigade, who had left their own bivouac 3 miles west of Gettysburg in mid-morning. As they arrived down the Chambersburg Pike, they were ordered to the right of the road, where they lay in line of battle near the eastern edge of a thin line of woods until mid-afternoon. The order to attack came at about 3 o'clock, and the 26th North Carolina began their charge, which would have to cross 300 yards of oat fields and Willoughby Run, a creek choked with underbrush and briars, before they reached the wooded slope of McPherson's Ridge and the waiting 24th Michigan. The 26th fought portions of other regiments along the way, but today we will focus primarily on the 24th Michigan because of the iconic status of their fight. The Michigan men fired 2 volleys as the North Carolinians crossed the field, but did their most destructive work as the attackers struggled through the briars at the creek. The 26th continued. Let's see if I get my slide to progress here. Any moment now. I'm getting the circle of death here. The 26th continued to advance, and the 24th fell back a few dozen yards to a second defensive line where the fighting was at its most intense. Back here. Pardon me here. There we go. All right. So it fell back to a second line where the fighting was its most intense. With the pressure too great, the 24th Michigan fell back to a third line on the summit of the wooded ridge. The 26th made one final push, and the 24th Michigan retreated off of the ridge and out of the woods. The 26th part of the battle thus ended, as regiments from General William Dorsey Pender's division took over and pressed the Iron Brigade back. The 24th Michigan, however, took 3 more defensive stands, the last at a rail fence barricade near the Lutheran Seminary with the rest of the Iron Brigade and a few other units, before finally retreating through the town at about 4:30 p.m. Both sides suffered enormous casualties. Though exact numbers are difficult to ascertain, the 24th Michigan lost 3/4 of its nearly 500 men, including its colonel, and the 26th North Carolina lost nearly 2/3 of its approximately 900 men. Additionally, the 26th had 13 color bearers shot down during the charge, including their colonel and lieutenant colonel. And many historians have told this story, as well as the rest of the epic Battle of Gettysburg, but few scholars have attempted to follow the saga of these men beyond the battle or the war. What were the repercussions of the battle, not on the armies, which is a familiar story, but on the men who fought, on their families and their communities? How did 1 hour of battle reverberate for decades and even generations after the fight? This paper seeks to start uncovering that story, the one that the participants and their loved ones often considered to be the real story of the battle. By focusing on just these 2 regiments, this type of study allows us to see some of the larger consequences of battle on a society that had to live with the physical, economic, social, and psychological consequences long after the guns fell silent. To begin telling that less familiar story, let us see what happened to Peter Byrd. Though he had participated in the largest battle of his nation's life, the most significant and ceaseless battle of his own life began even as the Confederate troops passed by his bleeding body lying in the smoke-shrouded woods. He lay in the same spot for 4 days before he received any relief. Colonel had returned to the field under Confederate supervision to retrieve their wounded, but they did not see Byrd. Not until late afternoon on July 5th was Byrd finally discovered. His brother Robert found him and moved to a temporary hospital. With so many wounded to be treated, Byrd had to wait until July 6th before surgeons finally examined his mangled leg. Doubtful of his survival, the surgeons moved him to a nearby feed store to die. When a member of the Detroit Board of Trade visited the battlefield on July 12th, he was shocked at the sight of the gruesomely wounded Byrd. He found Byrd, however, surprisingly upbeat and happy in the hope of restoration to friends, even though the doctors assured the visitor that Byrd could not live. Yet, Byrd defied all medical expectations. On about July 15th, a surgeon finally began treating the wound, cutting into the flesh to remove the lead ball and a few pieces of bone that had splintered off. He decided not to amputate, a decision that probably saved Byrd's life, but instead set the bone and immobilized the leg in a box of bran for 4 months. By November, the fracture of the bone had united, but the wound continued open and discharged large quantities of pus and a few pieces of bone. The leg continued this way for months. In April of 1865, as the nation celebrated the surrender of Lee's army, Byrd found himself going under the knife again, this time at St. Mary's Hospital in Detroit to remove shattered pieces of the bone still detaching from the compromised femur. The surgery did not permanently solve the problem, and Byrd submitted to another surgery 6 years later. Despite the complications associated with his injury, Byrd married his 21-year-old sweetheart, Mary Jane Morris, on November 27, 1864, and together they had 9 children. So while his leg may not have worked, certain other parts worked just fine. After serving as a lighthouse keeper in northern Michigan for a decade after the war, Peter and his family moved back to their hometown of Romulus in 1874. Once in Romulus, Peter became an active Republican Party leader, a justice of the peace, and a township supervisor. He farmed, sold life insurance, and served for 10 years as Deputy Register of Deeds for Wayne County. Peter may have traveled once with his brother Robert to visit Gettysburg, or at the very least, they visited Paul Philippeteau, who was working on his epic painting of the battle. Supposedly, the artist became so taken with the Byrds and their story that he painted them into his famous depiction of Pickett's charge, even though Peter was still lying in McPherson's woods at this moment of the battle. But because of his increasing debilitation, Peter was neither able to attend the Michigan Day in June of 1889, when the Michigan Monument was dedicated near the spot where he lay wounded, nor any other celebrations of the battle. Despite not attending the battlefield reunions, there was rarely a day in which Peter did not remember his wounding of July 1st. The twice daily treatment of his wound involved many members of his family and likely exerted significant influence on his children. One became a doctor and another entered the pharmacy business. In 1901, Byrd described his daily regimen. There is a hole at the seat of the wound, and there is a continual discharge of pus from this hole. It is necessary to insert a drain to keep this hole open, and sometimes it has been necessary to cut it open. Peter described his limitations, saying the wound requires so much dressing and attention that I cannot be away from home for any length of time. I am home every night. Nearly 40 years after the battle, his wife and his son Richard still constantly attended to the wound. Peter admitted at first Richard did not like to do the work. But when Peter nearly died from an infection at the wound site, Richard relented and dealt with the unpleasant task of inserting the drain into his father's leg. Richard described the process. I have to probe it and inject peroxide of hydrogen to cleanse it. There has to be a piece of gauze inserted for drainage. After he applied cotton outside the wound to absorb the drainage, he wrapped it tight with a bandage. There was no relief, as the operation had to be performed every morning and every night, regardless of everyone's health or exhaustion, to prevent a potentially fatal infection. This continued for 49 years until Peter's death in October of 1912. Not far from Byrd on July 1st was 21-year-old Private John Coy, who was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and hailed from one of the oldest Dutch families to ever settle in colonial America. As he stood in the battle line facing the enemy, a bullet entered his upper torso and practically exploded his right shoulder when it exited. The ball shattered the scapula in such a way that surgeons extracted nearly 50 pieces of the bone, and he never regained any motion in his arm. A friend remembered that he was a great sufferer from the gunshot wound, which gives him great pain all of the time. Doctors continued to remove pieces of bone from the wound for many years. Discharged from the army soon after the battle, Coy returned home after Gettysburg in broken health. Unable to fend for himself because of his deformed shoulder and paralyzed arm, Coy lived with his younger brother and his family in the years after the war. Coy met and married 19-year-old Florence L. Marvin in 1871, and they established their own household in Unionville, Michigan, though Coy's second cousin also lived with them as a full-time sick nurse, indicating the delicate nature of Coy's health. Coy became a postmaster and a druggist in the small village where Florence gave birth to their 3 daughters, but Coy's physical disabilities burdened his family. His wife remarked that he cannot dress himself or feed himself without my help. She had to wait on him throughout the day as he was confined indoors for most of his life, but there was little peace in the nighttime either, as Coy was haunted by physical and psychological pain. Coy spent the year 1891 confined entirely to his bed. The paralysis in his shoulder had slowly spread throughout his body. Near the end of his fight with the insidious illness, his tongue became paralyzed and he lost all control of his bowels. It was a humiliating and agonizingly slow death. For 28 years, his body had been continually fighting the Battle of Gettysburg. How often, while lying helpless in bed, did he think of the battle that had altered his life? Whether or not he ever talked about the battle, he was unable to forget it. His excruciating pain finally ceased on March 6, 1891, one day after his 20th wedding anniversary, when the paralysis reached his heart. Joining Coy in the line with Company A on July 1st was Private Solomon Benster, a 6-foot-tall, ruggedly strong machinist from southwest Detroit, just 3 weeks shy of his 19th birthday. The fifth of 13 children, Solomon enlisted in the summer of 1862 with his father and older brother. As the men of the 26th North Carolina charged on that July afternoon, Benster fired several rounds at them. At one point, while facing the rebels, Benster bent over 90 degrees, perhaps to pick up something he had dropped or perhaps to tend to a wounded friend, we'll never know. At that moment, Benster was struck simultaneously by 2 bullets. The first bullet crashed into his left shoulder, breaking the bones as it passed diagonally through his body, passing through the left lung and lodging against his right hip bone. The ball partially paralyzed his left arm. Once it healed, it contracted so much that people thought his left arm was much smaller than his right. The second bullet struck his right shoulder, missed the major bones of the shoulder, but passed through his lung cavity, bumped against his sternum, and lodged in the muscles of his stomach close to his heart. Both bullets remained inside his body for the rest of his life. Benster applied for an invalid pension 3 months after the battle. His left arm was nearly useless, but the bullet that lodged against his hip also impinged on the nerve, causing his right leg and hip to trouble him throughout his life. His back and core muscles atrophied. 31 years after the battle, Benster wrote, "I have never been able to perform manual labor since my discharge." He also revealed that for 3 years, I had to be tied to a chair back to be kept upright. He admitted, "This is one of my main troubles at present and always will be." As he aged, his heart grew weaker and he developed a nervous condition that prevented him from sleeping through the night. Despite his physical problems, Benster took up photography and moved to the growing city of Toledo, Ohio in 1869, where he opened his own business. He managed to support himself and his family with his business and some monthly financial assistance from the U.S. Pension Bureau as a result of his wartime disabilities. Benster remained a devoted member of the Iron Brigade Veterans Association after the war, and he attended the Michigan Day ceremonies at Gettysburg in June 1889. It was the only time in his life he ever revisited the scene of his disabling. But Benster's physical condition took a toll on his personal life as well. He married India King and had 2 sons with her, but they divorced a few years later, the physical and emotional effects of his wound undoubtedly playing a role. In fact, the Michiganders who were wounded at Gettysburg suffered from a divorce rate that was more than double the post-war average, suggesting that the physical and psychological damage of the battle was a significant stressor on relationships. Edward Choate, who was discharged after a severe leg wound, divorced twice. His second wife testified to his cruel and inhuman treatment of her. Justin Warner, who was disabled by a shot to the knee, was found guilty of several acts of extreme cruelty against his wife, who successfully divorced him. Patrick Clary, who was shot 4 times and lost a leg at Gettysburg. After the war, domestic violence became the norm at his house, as witnesses described Clary as a drunkard with a dangerous disposition and temper. He abused his wife, who threatened to poison him in retaliation. He tried to beat his stepson with an iron bar, and the stepson tried to shoot Clary with a revolver. Clary claimed that all of this disturbance stemmed from his wife's attempts to, quote, ridicule me because of my infirmities. Perhaps the psychological scars and sense of weakness due to their Gettysburg wounds led men like Choate and Warner and Clary to display their power against their dependents whenever possible. Company B had a particularly difficult experience in the battle. Of 54 men who went into the fight, only 8 emerged unscathed. One of those who went down was 27-year-old Friedrich Koch. Koch had left Germany for America at age 17, landing first in New Orleans before making his way to Chicago. While visiting Detroit in July 1862, he joined the 24th Michigan. In McPherson's woods, just as he was reaching the second line of battle and was turning to face the enemy, he collapsed to the ground when a bullet blew a hole through his neck, splattering blood everywhere. The minie ball entered the left side of his neck about 3 inches below the ear and passed out the back part of the neck near the spinal cord. Left behind, he was later captured on the field by Confederates. Koch escaped from a Confederate field hospital 2 days later and hid with a local farmer who eventually carried him to Union lines. Koch was treated in a Harrisburg hospital where he received a 2-week furlough on August 1863. Koch, who could barely speak English and could not read a word of it, misunderstood the nature of his release from the hospital, believing he had been discharged from the Army rather than just given a 2-week furlough. He returned to Chicago, where his wound was treated continuously for 2 years. Koch would be classified as a deserter when he did not return from furlough, though he would not discover this until after the war when he applied for a pension and was repeatedly denied. Koch suffered from intense and unremitting pain in his head as a result of his wound, and he could not hold the job for very long because of it. For 40 years, he fought the Pension Bureau to have his record cleared, a process that included having a friend write to President William McKinley directly in 1901. But none of these efforts succeeded. Koch died alone, destitute, and undoubtedly in agony, unrewarded for the sacrifice he had made for his adopted country. Koch was not the only one who sacrificed at Gettysburg only to be denied a pension. Some soldiers, like Koch, fell through the bureaucratic cracks because of misunderstandings or because they could not provide witnesses to their wounds. For others who were killed or who later died from their wounds, their dependent family members were often rejected for various reasons. The mother of 19-year-old Elias Browning, who was killed in the battle, was denied a pension because she was not his biological mother. She had adopted him as an infant, but the pension officer explained there is no authority for granting pensions in such cases. Albert Wassow was killed standing in line next to Browning. His stepfather abandoned his mother at about the same time that he was killed at Gettysburg, leaving her alone and destitute. But the pension office rejected her claim because she was not entirely dependent on her son at the time of his death. The story of George Hubbell's mother is particularly poignant. After her only son died from a leg amputation, she applied for a pension, but the pension office asked for more proof of her dependency on George. In desperation, she sent all of her son's wartime letters to the Commissioner of Pensions to prove that he regularly sent his paychecks home to her. The letters, still today, remain in Hubbell's pension file in the National Archives. The commissioner denied her claim, but kept the letters, removing the most direct link to her son and rendering her dependent on charity. For these loved ones, the Battle of Gettysburg had devastating economic consequences to accompany their own emotional wounds. On July 1st, 1863, Detroit's John A. Partington had domestic concerns on his mind. A devoted and solicitous husband, he had left behind his young wife, Sarah, and 6-week-old daughter, Maria, when he joined the 24th Michigan in July 1862. In one of his last letters to his wife before the battle, he fondly celebrated Maria's birthday and lamented that he had not seen her since he had joined the Army the previous year. In the previous fall, he had written, "I prayed for you and baby last night till my eyes were wet with tears." In his poignant last letter home on June 22nd, he wrote, "Dear Sarah, you are in my thoughts all the time, and your picture I cover with kisses." As the 26th North Carolina approached to within 20 paces of his line, a shot through Partington's right lung knocked him to the ground. He died on the field. Private Edward A. Raymer had already seen several of his friends killed when he saw Partington go down, but he saw the man who had shot Partington as well. Raymer exacted his revenge. In his diary, Raymer wrote that he, quote, "shot the one who killed John Partington," end quote. Traumatized by the day's events, Raymer tried to numb his pain that night with some liquor he had illicitly acquired. And this is from Raymer's diary. "Lieutenant Buell rebuked me for drinking afterwards, said I would not be promoted." Raymer replied, "I do not care." In the weeks after the battle, Sarah Partington waited in vain for a letter from her husband. The long silence was tormenting, and no one could tell her definitely of John's fate. Chaplain William Way confessed on August 19th, "Those that I buried on the field were so changed that I should not have known his body had it been there." Sarah would not know for certain until September 1863 that John would not be coming home. He lay buried with countless others in an unmarked grave on the battlefield. As historian Drew Gilpin Faust has argued, the death of relatives far away from families and kin was particularly disruptive to fundamental 19th century understandings of the good death. For Sarah, as for so many other wives and mothers, there would be none of the cherished rituals of the good death. No observance of the dying, no recitations of faith, no opportunity to hear his last words, and no coffin to give him a decent burial. There would only be an emptiness that could not be filled. Sarah fended for herself with the assistance of a widow's pension until October 23, 1864, when she married one of John's friends, with whom she had 8 more children. John's daughter, Maria, came to know her real father only through the wartime letters her mother carefully preserved. Maria married, had 5 sons, and dedicated her life to education issues and national reform movements, becoming an active member of the women's suffrage movement and Women's Christian Temperance Union. One of her granddaughters found Maria's pioneering spirit to be an inspiration and a proof that with hard work, we also could achieve our goals. Though he gave his life at Gettysburg, without knowing what would become of his family, one descendant concluded that John, quote, would have been justly proud of his baby Maria. Standing in line with his Company B comrades was the French-Canadian laborer from Trenton, Michigan, Raphael Lafayette Viaud. In the fight that day, Viaud had turned to the right for a moment when 3 bullets from a Confederate volley felled him. One bullet benignly passed through the flesh of his left arm, but the second bullet fractured his right heel into 100 pieces. A third entered his back 4 inches above his hip, passed across his spine before exiting out of his right side. Some of Viaud's mates helped him to the rear, and he survived the fight. But he fought a much longer battle with the memory and the scars of Gettysburg. With a crippled back and a useless foot, Viaud bounced around hospitals until he was formally discharged for disability in November 1864, 11 days after he married Eulalie Dupuy. Soon after their wedding, Viaud and his wife moved to Oregon Township, just east of Toledo, Ohio. There they had 2 daughters, while Viaud tried to make a living as a farmer and later as a sawyer, but found himself physically unable to perform those jobs because of his wounds. His heel had never mended properly and became a continual open sore by 1882, which kept him house-ridden for nearly half of that year. The inability to provide a comfortable living for his family and the constant physical pain weakened Viaud's psyche. His physician noted that he became increasingly prone to spells of melancholy and nervous prostration. A comrade who saw him in the years after the war asserted, "I know that his wounds affected his mind from his strange manners. They were the cause of his mental derangement." Viaud battled his demons until July 1889. 4 days after the 26th anniversary of his wounding, Viaud took his own life. Eulalie never remarried and lived to an advanced age, drawing a $30 a month widow's pension. His 2 daughters lived into the 1950s, wondering what kind of man their father might have been had he never been at Gettysburg. While he saw his Company B comrades fall all around him, Corporal Charles McConnell did his job, firing at the enemy, maintaining the line, and passing on orders to fall back and reform. Born in Dublin, Ireland in 1841, he immigrated a month before his 6th birthday when his family fled that country's potato famine. They made their way to Detroit, where Charlie, as he was known, grew up and joined the 24th Michigan as a corporal on July 24, 1862. During the fight, McConnell had several near misses. One bullet tore through his shirt sleeve, while another ripped through his pants, somehow without finding flesh. It was indicative of fighting so blisteringly intense and close-quartered that one soldier wrote his parents, "I don't see how in the world that our men got off without them all getting killed." As he was retreating to a new position, McConnell was knocked flat by a bullet that struck him square in the back. Saving his life was his blanket, the ball cutting through 10 thicknesses of the tightly rolled covering. McConnell scrambled up and raced for the final defensive line at the seminary. As the Union line showed signs of giving way, McConnell reached into his cartridge belt and pulled out his last bullet. He took aim at a Confederate soldier carrying a battle flag in front of a regiment. A comrade shouted, "Charlie, can't you bring down that rebel color bearer?" And McConnell coolly replied, "That's the man I'm laying for." McConnell steadied his rifle on the branch of a tree, fired, and through the smoke from his barrel saw the flag and its carrier collapse to the ground about 30 yards away. He then turned and joined his comrades, beating a hasty retreat through the town of Gettysburg. McConnell had fired the 24th Michigan's last round on the first day's battle. McConnell was one of the only members of Company B who emerged from the battle and the war without suffering any serious wound. In 1867, he married a comrade's sister and they had a daughter. He dabbled at several jobs over the next 2 decades as a printer and a theater owner before becoming president of a Chicago-based drug company in 1892. He continued in the emerging pharmaceutical business, making handsome profits until his death, fittingly for an Irish son, on St. Patrick's Day, 1916. Throughout his post-war life, McConnell, who was active in the Grand Army of the Republic and served as president of the Iron Brigade Veterans Association, maintained an abiding interest in the 24th Michigan's role at Gettysburg. In 1896, he wrote a detailed account of the regiment's action on the first day, which he delivered as a speech to the Army of the Potomac Society in March of 1897, before publishing the piece in a soldier's newspaper. McConnell had been motivated to write his piece because he had been annoyed by what he called the one-sided and self-glorifying publications on the battle, which neither side has been disposed to treat its opponent fairly. McConnell also complained that, quote, the first day's Battle of Gettysburg has never been given proper appreciation by the Northern public, probably because it was a decided Union defeat, while the next 2 days were Union victories. McConnell had witnessed Pickett's charge, and he asserted that that famously doomed attack did not compare to the fighting of July 1st on McPherson's Ridge, which was, quote, cold-blooded, grim determination, give and take until both commands were nearly annihilated. It was the most desperate fighting of the entire war, he concluded, known to be such by all who participated in it. If not for the sacrifice of the Iron Brigade on July 1st, he argued, there would have been no later Union victory to salvage. McConnell would attend Michigan Day in 1889 and the battlefield reunions of 1893, 1903, and 1913. He even tried to put up a monument to the battle between the 26th North Carolina and the 24th Michigan, but never succeeded in making that happen. His efforts to tell a balanced story on the first day's fight led him to develop a personal bond with members of the 26th North Carolina in the post-war years over their shared experience. And indeed, the fight was every bit as devastating and personal for the men of the 26th North Carolina, both on the day of battle and in the years after. After lying in line for 2 hours that afternoon, William Buck Edwards of Company E was relieved when the order to charge finally came. The 21-year-old son of a Chatham County tailor went into the fight alongside his 18-year-old brother, Isaac. Buck later wrote, I was as anxious to go in as I ever was to do anything in my life. And as we went in, I could hardly keep from crying. I was so proud to see our boys go in so well. They had not gone far when the Yankees fired a volley at them, and soon the men of the 26th returned fire without orders, Edward recalled, but continued to advance and reload as they marched. Isaac went down in one of the earliest volleys with a bullet in his left hip, but Buck did not stop. He splashed into the Willoughby's Run and started advancing up the hill. As he closed with the Union's first line, Buck wrote, they run, though they did not go off fast, but slow, contesting every inch of the ground as they went. Shot through his right hip, Buck hobbled out of the woods and headed to the rear. Only then did he realize how devastating the Yankee fire had been. I found all my comrades lying almost in piles in some places, either dead or with all imaginable variety of wounds. Some would halt me and tell me they was bound to die, Buck wrote. My feelings was much hurt, but of course, I could not help them. A Chatham County comrade corroborated Buck's story. Hundreds lying wounded, some dying, others bleeding to death, others crying and saying, oh, can't you do something for me, or I shall die. As Buck retraced his steps across the oat field, he came upon his brother Isaac lying on the ground with a nasty wound. Buck helped him up, and the two wounded brothers struggled to the nearest ambulance, where we both got in and went to the hospital. For 2 days after the battle, they were treated for their hip wounds at a field hospital. On Saturday, July 4th, orders came for those who could walk to begin marching to Winchester, Virginia. Buck joined the walking wounded, but Isaac's more serious injury forced him to wait and ride in an ambulance. He was later captured by Union cavalry during the retreat. Meanwhile, Buck forever remembered the retreat as one of near starvation. I have been hungry in my life, but never was I so near perished. He confessed, I even picked up the bread from the wounded soldiers who would go to sleep and drop it. I would trim off the blood and eat the bread heartily. Buck marched over 200 miles through rain and mud to Richmond, where he checked into Winder Hospital. Buck returned to his Pittsboro, North Carolina home to convalesce on August 10th and found it nearly impossible to describe the first day's fight to his anxious neighbors. After the war, he took up farming, married, and fathered 9 children, giving his youngest son the middle name of Burgwin after his regimental commander who had died at Gettysburg. Buck also became a newspaper columnist who enjoyed statewide popularity. In his columns, he frequently recalled the Battle of Gettysburg. He died in Siler City, North Carolina on September 7th, 1927, 64 years after the battle, as Chatham County's last surviving Gettysburg veteran. Throughout the fight, companies E and F flanked the 26th North Carolina's battle flag, making them conspicuous targets for enemy fire. 3 members of the extended Setzer family from the mountainous Caldwell County served in Company F. Eli Setzer, 19, marched beside his 20-year-old cousin Joseph that afternoon. Their 23-year-old cousin Thomas was fortuitously detached for other duty that morning and missed the afternoon's fight. As Eli and Joseph advanced, the latter was wounded in one of the early volleys, struck by a minie ball that smashed his lower leg. Joseph was moved to a field hospital fairly quickly, but Eli had a far different experience. Eli made it across the creek and into the woods, probably to the 24th Michigan's second line of defense. As he stood within yards of the enemy line, Eli was struck by multiple bullets. At least 2 bullets hit one arm and another tore a hole through his coat. But one minie ball struck near the head of Eli's femur, shattering the bone into 100 pieces. The wound was so high up the leg that amputation was impossible, and the bone had disintegrated so badly that it could never be set and would surely become infected. Eli recognized immediately that he would not recover from his wound. He had many hours to contemplate his impending death because he could not move and spent the night on the field. Having missed the battle, Thomas Setzer scoured the battlefield that evening in search of his cousin. He found him in the woods suffering grievously. Thomas stayed by Eli's side all night and shortly after dawn flagged down some ambulance men and helped move Eli to a wagon to be carried to a nearby field hospital. As Thomas put him in the ambulance, Eli told him that he knew he was dying. He asked Thomas to write his folks and, quote, tell them how it was, end quote. An emotional Thomas earnestly promised to do so. The wagon carted the ashen Eli off as the disconsolate Thomas watched him ride over the horizon before he rejoined his company. Eli was moved to a field hospital where his cousin Joseph was already recovering from having his leg amputated above the knee the night before. There, the Setzers received a visit from a family friend and Caldwell County soldier, Lieutenant William A. Tuttle, on the morning of July 4th. Tuttle was dismayed to see his friend so hopelessly wounded. I don't think he will ever recover, Tuttle painfully admitted to Eli's father. His thigh was shivered close up to his hip. Tuttle was impressed by Eli's resigned acceptance of his fate. He told me that he was willing to die and that he hoped to meet me in heaven. Finding it difficult to say goodbye, Tuttle waited as late as he could and told them that he had to leave to stay ahead of the Yankees. With a heavy heart, I took their hands and a tear fell from our eyes and we parted. Eli died that afternoon, July 4th. Joseph died of infection 2 weeks later. The oldest child of yeoman farmer William Alfonso Setzer, Eli was close with his 6 siblings, especially his sister Harriet and his younger brother Daniel Columbus, who comforted Eli on the battlefield on the night of July 1st. Columbus married in 1867 and named his firstborn son after his big brother Eli. Joseph Setzer was the second of 7 children and oldest son of poor farmer Tillman Setzer, and like his cousin, he was close to his younger brothers David and Eli, who both named sons after their deceased oldest brother. Marching near the Setzers that day was their good friend Andrew Hull Dan Courtney. Recently married, Dan did not enlist until July 1862 after conscription had compelled him. His younger brother, Henry Clay Courtney, who had joined with the Setzers in the summer of 1861, was marching with Dan. Having turned 26 on the march to Pennsylvania, Dan's thoughts were of his sickly wife, who had given birth to a stillborn son 8 months earlier, and then discovered in March 1863 that someone had stolen their only plow right before spring planting began. On June 3rd, the unhappy Courtney wrote his wife, "I want to get home worse on your account than anything else. I know you are lonesome and see a heap of trouble." On June 24th, as the regiment was preparing to cross the Potomac River into Maryland, Dan knew the serious nature of the business that lay ahead. "I hope that God will spare my life to get home on your account," he wrote. In the attack that afternoon, his brother received only a flesh wound in the thigh, but a minie ball broke Dan's lower left leg. Carried to the same hospital as the Setzers, he lay near his friends, all three of them in agony. Clay retreated with the regiment back to Virginia, but Dan proved to be the lucky one. He would lose his leg, but Clay lost his life the next year at Spotsylvania. Union surgeons amputated Dan's infected leg on July 6th. He was sent to Baltimore and exchanged in August of 1863. He remained in Confederate hospitals until finally given a 60-day furlough in early October 1863. When Dan returned home, he made the most of his reunion with his wife, who gave birth to a son, John, 9 months later. Ultimately, Dan and Mary would raise 8 children on their farm and tannery near Lenoir, North Carolina. Dan died in 1909, but long after his death, Gettysburg continued to play a prominent role in his family's memory of him. Nearly 100 years later, one of his granddaughters published a family history, as inaccurate as it is revealing. The story of her grandfather's life began with his wounding at Gettysburg. She heard how he lay on the battlefield a long time before finally being removed to a hospital where doctors were too exhausted to do much for his leg, leading to its eventual amputation. This all rings true. But the story veers from the facts when family lore has Dan fashioning a wooden leg and stumping all the way home from Gettysburg just to see his wife and son, John. Of course, we know he did not walk home from Gettysburg and his son was born a year later. But the story demonstrates the mythical power the Battle of Gettysburg held for later generations. It became integral to how the family remembered and honored their father and grandfather. To the family, the battle was the central and most formative component of Dan Courtney's life. Nothing that came before was as important or memorable. On the afternoon of July 1st, 21-year-old Colonel Henry King Burgoyne, Harry to his family and friends, kept his men in line and provided for their comfort as much as possible until the order to attack came. The young colonel ordered his men forward at the quick step, and he followed a few steps behind the lines to be able to view their progress. They marched crisply through the oat field and bunched up a bit as they crossed the brambles of Willoughby Run. Once they got across the creek, Burgoyne reformed his lines and pressed on, the men firing as they marched. The Union troops fell back to their second line, where they made a firm stand. During the charge, one color bearer after another fell, but men kept picking the flag up and carrying it forward. At one point, near the second Union line, Burgoyne picked up the fallen flag and handed it to Private Frank Honeycutt. As Honeycutt turned to advance, he was killed by a Union volley. Burgoyne had turned to shout an order when a bullet from the same volley entered his left side, perforated both lungs, spun him around before dropping him flat on his back. When Lieutenant Colonel John R. Lane saw Burgoyne fall, he rushed to his colonel's side, grabbed his hand, and asked if he was badly hurt. Burgoyne could not find the breath to speak, and in answer to Lane's query, could only squeeze his hand and motion to his left side. Lane could not remain. He had to take over leadership of the regiment, and he left Burgoyne as others came to his aid. A wounded Lieutenant George Wilcox of Company 8 hobbled over to his Company H, hobbled over to his colonel. Burgoyne tried to speak, but the crash of battle drowned out the words. Calling over 2 soldiers to tend to the colonel, Wilcox limped back into the battle. One of the soldiers unrolled his blanket to use as a stretcher, and they carried Burgoyne toward the rear, stepping over the mangled and dead. After a long, slow trek, they reached the point where they had begun the charge that afternoon. Captain Lewis H. Young of Pettigrew's staff knelt over Burgoyne and said, "I regret to see you wounded as you are." Burgoyne replied, "I have no regrets. I fell in the defense of my country." He added, "We have gained the greatest victory of the war." A short while later, the quote-unquote boy colonel, because Burgoyne was only 21 years old, breathed his last. Unlike for so many soldiers, for Burgoyne, there was at least an approximation of the good death to partially satisfy his loved ones at home. Those soldiers with him at his death heard his acceptance of his fate, recorded his last words, which they related to his parents. They also buried Burgoyne in a makeshift coffin made out of an ammunition case and marked his grave so that his family could later retrieve the body. John R. Lane was only 3 days shy of his 28th birthday on July 1st, 1863. He had risen from corporal to lieutenant colonel in just over a year. That morning, beset by nausea, he felt he would be unable to fight. Burgoyne pleaded with him to stay and offered him some brandy. Lane took a few steps and soon felt well enough to remain. He took his position on the right of the regiment during the charge, communicating with Burgoyne until the colonel fell. After checking on the mortally wounded Burgoyne, Lane ran to the right to prepare his men for a final charge on the Union line on the summit of the hill. He returned to the center to see that Lieutenant Milton Blair of Company B had picked up the fallen colors. Lane asked for them, and Blair sardonically replied as he handed them over, "You will get tired of them." Lane ordered his men to fix bayonets. With the flag held high, he led the line forward into the teeth of the Union line still blazing away. For a moment, the smoke cleared, and General Pettigrew, well behind the line, could see clearly Lane leading the charge with the flag, prompting him to remark, "It is the bravest act I ever saw." Lane's bravery came at a heavy price. As they neared to within 30 yards of the enemy line, Lane turned to encourage his men to victory. As he walked backwards for a moment, a .58 caliber ball crashed through his neck at the base of his skull and came out of his mouth, carrying part of his chin, jaw, tongue, and several teeth with it, a seemingly fatal wound. The men of the 26th charged past the fallen Lane and drove the Yankees off the crest of McPherson's Ridge. With that desperate charge, the 26th North Carolina's part in the fighting had finally ended. Regiments from General Abner Perrin's and Alfred Scales's brigades of Pender's division made the final push to drive the Yankees away from Seminary Ridge. Some of the remnants of the 26th may have followed behind Pender's men and eventually reached the seminary building, but most stayed behind in the woods to tend to wounded friends or the regimental leaders in the process of carrying Lane's inert body to the rear. After his wound, Lane was at the mercy of the Almighty, for there was little doctors could do for him. He was loaded into a wagon full of wounded and started back to Virginia. Along the way, a Union cavalry detachment attacked the caravan, and Lane, though weak from hunger and his wound, jumped out of the wagon, grabbed a riderless horse, and made his escape. He eventually made his way to Virginia and was back at home in Chatham County by August 4th on extended furlough. Remarkably, Lane recovered and rejoined the regiment before his furlough was over. In fact, he was wounded several more times during the war, but survived. He returned to his home on Little Brush Creek in Chatham County, where he ran a general store and grist mill before eventually establishing a lucrative business which sold horses, mules, and land. In the post-war years, Lane gave several speeches about his regiment's experience at Gettysburg, including a memorable one in 1903 at the 40th Battlefield Reunion. Lane continued participating proudly in tributes to Confederate forces until he died on December 31st, 1908. During the last decades of his life, Lane corresponded frequently with veterans of the 26th and those who wished to preserve its history, including Will Burgoyne, the younger brother of Harry, who became the regiment's unofficial historian. At the very moment that his older brother was wounded at Gettysburg, Lieutenant William Hislop Sumner Burgoyne was resting in the remnants of the Yankee entrenchments that he and his men had just demolished on the Williamsburg Road a few miles east of Richmond. As part of the 35th North Carolina Regiment, he was keeping watch on Union forces scouting the eastern approaches to the Confederate capital. The first rumor of Gettysburg arrived on a rainy Tuesday, July 7th, relaying, quote, the glorious news that Lee had captured 40,000 of Meade's army, and Will optimistically believed it to be true. It was not until Sunday, July 12th, that Will got the first inkling of bad news, hearing third hand that his brother had been killed. I could not bear to believe it, and I do not, Will wrote to his diary. The next day, he took a train to Petersburg, Virginia. As he stepped from the car, his brigade quartermaster found him and claimed that the report of Harry's death was certainly incorrect. Will was so relieved that he immediately telegraphed his mother to share the good news. However, the next day, Will learned the truth. He was devastated that Harry, My dear beloved brother, whom I had just began to appreciate for his good and noble qualities, was dead. Will and Harry had their sibling difficulties, occasionally resenting the other's successes or achievements. Like many brothers, certainly like my own brother and myself, the two could not be together for very long without irritating each other. But their bond was strong, and Will greatly admired his big brother. He confessed that Harry's death presses with a heavy load on my heart, and I find difficulty in believing or realizing it. 5 months later, on Christmas Day, Will lamented, the only thing that saddened the day was that my poor brother Harry had been killed and could not be with us. The rest of the family was also badly affected by Harry's death. Harry's presumed fiancée never married. The health of his father, with whom Harry was very close, declined rapidly. He suffered a stroke just 4 months after Gettysburg. Harry was constantly in the thoughts of his mother, Anna. On June 9th, 1867, Anna attended the reinterment of Harry's Gettysburg coffin in Raleigh's historic Oakwood Cemetery. A surviving journal of Anna's final year of life has 5 entries in 6 months referring to Harry. One of her last entries ever, on February 25th, 1887, poignantly notes that that day was, quote, the anniversary of my last parting with dear Harry, end quote. While the family felt the loss of Harry for decades after his death, Will went to the greatest lengths to make sure his brother's memory was preserved. That memory was connected with the memory of the 26th sacrifice at Gettysburg. After the war, Will became a lawyer and a banker, but in his free time, he compiled all that he could about the 26th North Carolina. He engaged in lengthy correspondences with various members of the unit in attempts to understand the history of his brother's regiment. When his friend, Judge Walter Clark, began to publish his 5-volume history of several North Carolina regiments, Will ghost wrote the history of the 26th North Carolina himself, but gave credit to an assistant surgeon as the author. He gave numerous speeches and organized several memorials to Confederate soldiers. His obsession with learning every detail about the fight on the first day at Gettysburg meant that he learned a lot about the 24th Michigan as well. In his last years, he became friends with a surviving veteran of that regiment, none other than Charles McConnell. In November of 1896, while attempting to write his own history of the first day's fight, McConnell was put in contact with Burgoyne, beginning a lengthy, intimate correspondence between the two. For Burgoyne, McConnell offered a tangible and emotional connection to the battle that had taken his brother's life. The two met several times near the turn of the century. In one meeting in Richmond in 1900, McConnell mentioned to Burgoyne, sort of in passing, that he had shot a color bearer with his last bullet, and assumed that that color bearer must have been from the 26th North Carolina. Burgoyne immediately responded, "Then you are the man who shot Colonel Lane." Burgoyne arranged to introduce McConnell to Lane, and the two former antagonists met in 1903 and became fast friends. However, it should be noted that Lane's wife refused to ever meet McConnell. She always held a grudge against him for supposedly shooting her husband. 2 months later, on July 4th, 1903, at Gettysburg, in a moving ceremony, Lane delivered a speech to assembled veterans about the 26th North Carolina's fight. After his oration, an emotional Lane pulled McConnell onto the stage with him and announced, "This is the man that shot me." McConnell, equally moved and fighting back tears, replied, "I thank God that I did not kill you." Each man had photos taken at the 24th Michigan Monument, individually, together, and even one with Will Burgoyne. All 3 men died secure in the knowledge that McConnell had shot Lane and satisfied by the tone of forgiveness that they had fostered in 1903. It achieved renewed currency during the war's sesquicentennial as news organizations and bloggers touted their 1903 reunion as the epitome of reconciliation. Nearly every historian who has written about the two regiments or the Battle of Gettysburg since 1903 tells their story. It is a great story. In fact, it's the perfect story to end this presentation, except it's not a true story. McConnell may have shot some poor color bearer, but it was not Lane or anyone from the 26th North Carolina. More than 150 years later, we are still detangling the web of myths and falsehoods that have spun themselves into the history of Gettysburg. Lane had been shot at the edge of Herbst's Woods on McPherson's Ridge. That's as far as the 26th North Carolina went. While McConnell fired his last shot at the barricade near the seminary building some 400 yards away. McConnell did not know that the North Carolinians had ended their fight at McPherson's Ridge and not continued on to the seminary. Will Burgoyne had never been to Gettysburg before in his life and did not understand that there was a quarter-mile gap between McPherson's Ridge, where Lane was shot, and Seminary Ridge, where McConnell fired his last bullet. And Lane, of course, had no clue who shot him. He simply believed what his friend Burgoyne told him. All three men wanted the story to be true, as it not only imbued the battle and their connections to it with a deeper significance, but it also offered a sense of closure. Thus, a mythic moment made its way into history. Today's presentation is, as I mentioned at the beginning, just a teaser of a much larger project that I'm working on that asks the question, how does one battle affect families and communities for decades? What are its repercussions on the fabric of society? The stories of the crippled but resilient Peter Byrd, the depressed and suicidal Lafayette Vio, and the families that were affected by their battle experiences are seldom told in Civil War histories. The battle greatly altered the lives of the families of John Partington and Eli and Joseph Setzer, who were all buried on the field. The desire to remember, or at least understand the fight, dominated the lives of Charles McConnell and Will Burgoyne, and touched thousands of others who read their works. These accounts of how societies deal with the wreckage of battle in personal and individual ways do not often make it into traditional battle narratives, but they are just as important, and I would argue we can relate to them in a way that we cannot with standard battle histories. I wager that none of us has experienced putting our life on the line with muzzle-loading black powder weapons and being treated by medieval medical techniques. But few, if any, among us can say that our families have not been significantly shaped by a loved one's military experience in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, Iraq, or Afghanistan. In my own family, it's very real. My maternal grandfather served in World War II in the Navy, was at the Battle of Okinawa, came home from the war a changed man, an alcoholic, and died in 1976 when I was 2 years old from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The family always said it was an accident. My mother never believed that. The psychological, physical, economic, and emotional effects of a conflict are something that people of all classes and ethnicities and gender in the 21st century can identify with. By studying these reverberations of battle, we can more fully understand and more fully and intimately understand the costs, sacrifices, and legacies of the Civil War. Thank you. And that's my note to James that I'm done. So he can run back to the front.
Okay. I'm just going to say before I stop recording, Judkin, that despite the audio difficulties, might be the best roundtable presentation I have seen since I moved to Ann Arbor. That was really great. So let me stop recording.